Meanwhile, Russia and China both condemning the U.S. operation Midnight Hammer. The U.S. adversaries proposing that the UN Security Council adopt a resolution for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire in the Middle East. Officials in Beijing said the move, quote, seriously violates the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and international law and exacerbates tensions in the Middle East. Joining me now is Gatestone Institute senior fellow Gordon Chang. Gordon, interesting that China is coming out with all of these comments, no mention of the fact that they were a week away from having 9 nuclear bombs. Talking about
yes, and also
international law.
Yes, and also no mention that China made sure that Iran had everything it needed to build a nuclear device. They sent it directly to Iran. Also, they armed Pakistan, and then Pakistan merchandised it to Iran with the knowledge and approval of China. And I think the United States needs to start calling China out. China made this war virtually inevitable by doing that. And the United States needs to say that in clear tones, because China is maliciously criticizing the U.S. and Russia is doing that as well. So we need to be clear.
You know, it's interesting that you say this, because all the while I feel like President Trump has tried hard not to poke the bear too much as to affect the global economy, and certainly the U.S.'s reliance on the China supply chain. And that's really what it comes down to. I think if President Trump had his ways or really wanted to move fast, he would. But he knows that it will cause a massive disruption in the United States supply chain. And prices will go up because we will not have all the cheap stuff that we currently buy from China, Gordon. So there's a long-term plan, I think, that the president has been on track on with regard to China, getting all these American companies to, you know, get their supply chains into America. But there's also a short-term plan that seems to be slower. Am I right?
Yes, you're certainly right about that. One of the good things, of course, is that the tariffs have really not showed up in the price data for the United States. We haven't seen the inflation that many people worried about. Yeah. And one of the reasons is that China actually has absorbed much of the tariffs, many of the tariffs, and so have companies. So really what we have is a pretty good situation so far. But I understand this. And with regard to the supply chain, we also got to remember that China has not complied with its May 12th obligations to start issuing those export licenses for rare earths. It's done that for the big 3 car makers where they've issued the licenses, but not for other purchasers. So really, this is a question of making sure that the Chinese comply with their obligations. And probably the only way to do that is to raise tariffs on China, because it's made it very clear that it will not honor its promises.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that. I mean, look, China has been really tough, and they're also demanding lots of information in order to release the rare earth minerals, right? The Financial Times reported that they want information from companies as well as the countries. They want to know what these rare earth minerals are going to be used for. I asked the Secretary of State yesterday, Marco Rubio, about China, and he's urging Beijing to stop Iran from closing the Strait of Hormuz. Watch this. Do you expect Iran to move to close the Strait of Hormuz to try to disrupt oil transportation across the world?
Well, I encourage the Chinese government in Beijing to call them about that, because they heavily depend on the Straits of Hormuz for their oil. If they do that, it'll be another terrible mistake. It's economic suicide for them if they do it. And we retain options to deal with that. But other countries should be looking at that as well. It would hurt other countries' economies a lot worse than ours. It would be, I think, a massive escalation that would merit a response, not just by us, but from others. We had 3 objectives. We struck those 3 objectives with decisive force. And that was the point of this mission, and that's what we achieved. What happens next will depend on what they do. They want to negotiate, we're ready to negotiate. They want to get cute and do things that are dangerous, we have responses available that are devastating.
Gordon, your reaction?
Yeah, I agree with Secretary Rubio. We get 5% of our oil through the Strait of Hormuz. China gets 50%. I'm not sure that we should be calling on China to take a larger role in a solution because, as I mentioned, they created the conditions for this war in the first place. Yeah, I believe that we should open the Strait of Hormuz if Iran closes it, as its parliament voted, but we should only open it for our friends, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan. We should not open it for Chinese cargoes. We need to start getting real about what's going on, and we need to say these things in public, because we have allowed the Chinese to undermine the international system and now to criticize us, and we don't criticize back.
Yeah. Liz Peek.
Gordon, Russia has a very different posture here because, after all, they're going to benefit from higher oil prices. So how do you think those two, I guess, allies kind of confront Iran, or how are they going to work together? If there is a ceasefire, as China calls for, what kind of negotiating tactic do you think China would be encouraging as opposed to Russia?
Yeah, they do have different interests when it comes to the price of oil, but Russia has relieved China's problems because it is an oil producer, and it can provide on a discounted basis oil to China, which it has been doing because the Chinese have been using their bargaining position. The thing about Russia is that just 24 hours ago, you had Dmitry Medvedev, the former president and current Russian official, actually talk about countries selling enriched uranium to Iran.
Yeah.
And clearly that is something that we have got to talk about in public because that is something that's always been in the background that Iran's been able to do. And maybe it actually has already done so. And so that's a consideration that we have not really taken into account yet. And neither has the International Atomic Energy Agency, which allowed Iran to violate its obligations to the international community.
Very good. Very important conversation, Gordon. We so appreciate your insights. Thank you, sir.